And when you identify the neurons on the diagrams and on exams and quizzes, you should always include whether it's parasympathetic or sympathetic. Okay? Not just identify it as pre or post. So this is a parasympathetic pre-ganglionic neuron. Based on location, what was another term that we use for the parasympathetic system, describing where we find the preganglionic cell bodies? Yeah, cranial sacral, right? So this is known as the cranial sacral system. And so we find our preganglionic cell bodies in the brainstem. And in the sacral spinal cord. So in the brainstem, these would be the 4 cranial nerves: oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. Right? And in the spinal cord, we call these preganglionic neurons the pelvic sphincter. Swank. Like Nick. But Nick.
There's Joe and.
All right. So typically, by typically, I'm talking about vagus and sacrosplanchnic. Okay, because it's kind of in between for the other ones. We have a long preganglionic neuron. And it's going to synapse with the cell body of the postganglionic, parasympathetic postganglionic neuron. And then its axon is relatively short and is found in the, or at the effector organ. Effector is whatever it's going to synapse with. So this would be a smooth muscle, or cardiac, or gland cell. This would be our ganglion. And what's the neurotransmitter that's released?
Acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is also released by our postganglionic neuron. And so because of that, the parasympathetic system is also known as the cholinergic system. Now we have receptors that bind the acetylcholine on the postganglionic neuron. And we have receptors that bind the acetylcholine on our epithelial, our glandular cells, on our cardiac muscle, and on the smooth muscle. So if we come back to our receptors on the postganglionic neuron, these postganglionic receptors for acetylcholine, how do we classify them? Ionotropic or metabotropic? Ionotropic. These are ionotropic, and the ion that they allow to pass through sodium. So that's going to depolarize the cell, and so this is an excitatory event. We make EPSPs at this site. All right, so ionotropic receptors that bind acetylcholine are also classified as nicotinic. If I could have talked this fast yesterday, we would have been done in 10 minutes. So this results in excitatory postsynaptic potentials in our postganglionic neuron. And if those reach threshold, then we set an action potential down the postganglionic neuron, and that causes it to also release acetylcholine, which binds to receptors on the effector organ. All right? So these effector organ receptors for acetylcholine are not channels. These are the metabotropic receptors. Remember, they use G proteins, so they will affect G proteins, either excite the alpha or excite the gamma components, and will indirectly excite or inhibit the effector cell. Typically, if it inhibits, it's because it's opening potassium channels. All right? In the brain, we use glycine to open chloride channels, but typically out in the periphery with these organs, they are potassium channels. And positive ions leave the cell. If they are excitatory, they typically open sodium or calcium. Yes?
For the inhibitory, does only the potassium leave at that point?
To inhibit.
Only the potassium channels are open.
Right. Sometimes what happens with the excitatories, we already have open potassium channels, and the current coming in when we open the sodium closes the potassium ones that are already open, and that further helps the inside of the cell to become more positive.
Okay,
Because we're not losing the positive
will
potassium.
stay in and the calcium.
Right. All right, so that's parasympathetic. I'm going to leave that on that side of the board and look at sympathetic. So this is essentially vagus or pelvic. I'm sorry, let me just add one more term. This is an example of vagus or the pelvic splanchnics. The entire physiology is right, but as far as having a long preganglionic nerve, it fits that because our ocular motor also has a relatively longer postganglion. It's outside the neuron. I mean, it's outside the effector. So that's what's illustrated on the right-hand side of the diagram that's on the overhead. So we have the preganglionic neuron, relatively long, going to the autonomic ganglion, and then a relatively short postganglionic neuron providing innervation. Okay. So now let's look at our sympathetic pathway. And this has a couple of different combinations, so I'm going to give the typical one. And I'm going to draw it on the other, behind the screen, so that we can compare the two. Missing a light over this board. All right, so sympathetic nervous system, preganglionic neuron, and where do we find the preganglionic neuron for sympathetic? If parasympathetic is cranial sacral, how would we describe?
Lateral great horn.
Pardon, the lateral great horn of what part of the spinal cord? Thoracic and lumbar. So this is also known as the thoracolumbar system, and it would be in the lateral great horn. Now, as we're going to see in a few minutes, there is a great variety in the length of our preganglionic neurons. Many of them, all the ones that go out to the skin and skeletal muscles of our body, are about 2 inches long. Okay? The ones that go to our organs, our abdominal and visceral organs, are going to be 8 to 10 inches long. Some of the ones that go out to the side of the body that are 2 inches long are a little bit longer than that because they go up or down a few spinal cord levels. So again, I'm going to draw what's called a typical sympathetic one. And we'll bring it out here. And it forms a ganglion, a series of ganglion on either side of the spinal column. So it's going to synapse with the postganglionic neuron. And this will be relatively long if it has to go out to the skin of my fingers or the skin of the sweat glands at the bottom of my feet. So this is my ganglion. And if it's found along the side of the vertebral column, it's known as the paravertebral ganglion. But some of them are found, the ones that have longer preganglionic neurons are found in front of the aorta, and those are called prevertebral. So I'm going to put that in parentheses. Because we also have prevertebral. And then this will go to its effector. Which is smooth muscle, again, cardiac muscle, glandular cells. All right, so what is our neurotransmitter at the ganglion? Acetylcholine. Excellent. And our neurotransmitter at the effector cell we'll talk about on Tuesday, but it is norepinephrine. Now the adrenal glands make epinephrine, which gets into the bloodstream. It's very similar, okay? So typically it's going to be norepinephrine, or it could also be epinephrine. And in a few cases, actually, it is acetylcholine. We do have sympathetic neurons, a few of them that release acetylcholine. Now, receptor. What is the receptor for acetylcholine on our postganglionic neuron? Exactly the same. Okay? So the postganglionic receptor acetylcholine receptor is ionotropic. Open sodium channels. Because of allowing positive cell of ions into the cell, it is excitatory. Creates EPSPs and is a nicotinic receptor. Okay, it was one of those lists of where we find nicotinic receptors that we looked at yesterday. So exactly the same everything as we find on postganglionic parasympathetic neurons. Nothing new there. However, when we get to our effector receptors, the effector receptors for acetylcholine are nicotinic, so we're going to talk about that separately on Tuesday. But these are still metabotropic. Associated with a G protein. They can do the same thing, all right? So indirectly open or close. How did I phrase that? Excite or inhibit. More so than acetylcholine, when they excite, they tend to open calcium channels. And when they inhibit, potassium. Now these are not called muscarinic. Remember we called these muscarinic because they will bind that extract, that's the word I couldn't think of it yesterday, extract of mushrooms. And we don't have other drugs typically that are directly, primarily associated with these receptors. And so on Tuesday we're going to talk about alpha and beta receptors. Alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, though there are a few more than those. So in your heart, we have beta 1 receptors, which excite the heart. In the lungs, we have beta 2 receptors, which inhibit the smooth muscle of the lungs. And so we can look at the difference in function based on the type of receptor. So this is the information that I want you to know for the comprehensive exam, okay? In your lecture notes, in the take-home exam, it gets a lot more detailed as far as the drugs and chemicals and all that kind of stuff. But this is the concept that I would expect you to pull away as a general component. If you want to take pictures, I'm done writing. Okay?
For the paravertebral ganglions, where did you say those?
Paravertebral are the ones that are beside, para meaning next to. They're beside the vertebral column. So on this model, there are very few autonomic nervous system models. But on these models here, there's a cluster of pink dots running down the side of each vertebral column connected by a white line. Those are the paravertebral ganglia. And the prevertebral are going to be on the aorta and thread. I'll show you some illustrations by Netter in just a moment.
What's running? Okay. It's whoa.
M-U-S, sorry, it looks like an O.
Yeah.
Muscarinic. Let me write it so you don't have to tilt your head.
Thank you. Like I already have problems with spelling, so I'm like, wait.
You said in front of the aorta?
On the anterior surface, ventral surface of the aorta. Okay?
Same thing, right?
Hold on, I wish I had one of those smart boards that I could push a button and it'd print out a copy for everybody.
Or you just do your hand in a circle and it erases everything?
Yeah.
So we had a professor that she would forget that she's at the board, she'd stand there and try to do the whole
Oh,
square.
really?
It's like,
What are you?
it's like, Professor, what are you doing? It's not. Oh, she's like, oh yeah, I gotta write. Those 6, 7 a.m. classes will really get you.
I mean, I have some high-tech equipment, but I don't use it so often that that's all I know how it. All right, so what I'm going to diagram over on the right-hand side now is cross-sections of spinal cord, and we will change the various levels that I'm diagramming.
You want to keep the gum? I have lots of things.
So our sympathetic nervous system does a little bit more as far as what it innervates than the parasympathetic. It has a little bit more complicated, well, a lot more complicated pathway of getting there. So the preganglionic cell bodies shown here in green are found in the thoracic and lumbar levels of the spinal cord. They leave the spinal cord and enter ganglia. And then we're going to be looking at how do those postganglionic neurons get to the skin and the skeletal muscle. How do they get to the head? How do they get to the organs? And we have 3, if you include every little step, a little bit more than that, pathways that they can travel for this to happen. And that's also shown in the diagram at the bottom of page 87. All right. So here you can see, this is a diagram that is the kind of complementary diagram to the one I showed of Vegas that had that big gap in the middle because we had no parasympathetic preganglionic fibers from the cervical, lumbar, and thoracic regions. Well, here you can see that we have no preganglionic sympathetic from the brainstem at all. We have none from the cervical. The cervical doesn't have any autonomic. It never has sympathetic and it never has parasympathetic. Then we have preganglionic fibers leaving the thoracic region and the lumbar region. So from T1 down to L2, L3 and L4 don't have any, and then down to the sacrospinal cord, the conus medullaris. We don't have any of those. So sacral, it looks like coccyx is having some, but these two just come together and join. So there are no preganglionic sympathetic fibers leaving the spinal cord after L2. And we're talking about the L2 region where those ventral roots and spinal nerves would be passing between the lumbar vertebra. But yet, all of these organs above and below still require sympathetic innervation. So these are illustrating the paravertebral ganglia that I just mentioned. So the paravertebral ganglia are associated with every level of spinal nerve in the thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. Above, we only have 3. So we have 8 cervical spinal nerves, but we only have 3 cervical ganglia. So out of leaving these 3 cervical ganglia, we have multiple branches to supply all 7 of the cervical nerves. Plus, as you can see, going to the eye and the salivary glands, we have our sympathetic fibers are going to go up into the skull to get access to those structures via branches of the internal carotid artery. One thing I want to point out here, and I'll point out again, we also send branches back down into the thoracic cavity from the middle and inferior cervical nerves to get to the heart and the lung. Okay, so they go up into the neck and then come back down into the thoracic cavity. So we're going to be looking, here's what the patterns that I'm going to be diagramming. I'm going to show, first of all, I'm going to do it more slowly and deliberately, what happens, the pathway for a cervical sympathetic, preganglionic, thoracic sympathetic neuron that comes into its posterior, into its autonomic ganglia, and then goes out to the skin. That's the most simple pathway. Because our skin receives sympathetic nerves to sweat glands and to smooth muscle. What happens when you get scared to the color of your skin? It goes pale or white. That's because sympathetic is causing the blood vessels in the dermis of your skin to constrict. Okay? It's also going to the blood vessels in your skeletal muscle, and there it's causing it to dilate, so that your skeletal muscles have additional oxygen because you're in a dangerous situation, you need to fight or run away. So the blood vessels to your skin constrict, the blood vessels to your digestive organs constrict, but the blood vessels to your skeletal muscles dilate. So to get these neurons out to the periphery, the soma of the body, they're going to travel out there with our spinal nerves, the same ones that innervate the skeletal muscles or carry sensory information back from the skin are going to contain these postganglionic neurons. There are no parasympathetic neurons that go to skeletal muscle or skin. All right? So all of the autonomic changes that occur are due to sympathetic. So then we're going to cover that, how that pathway works, and then we're going to look at how we get neurons up and down the sympathetic chain. How do we get neurons out the nerves where there are no preganglionic neurons coming from the spinal cord? And then finally we'll end up doing the same thing at the lower region. And that's lecture for today. Okay? We're not going to cover receptors and neurotransmitters today. This is just another, Sam, you were asking about the prevertebral ganglia. Those are found here in front of the aorta, so we'll get to those as well. This diagram shows that complicated, sorry for the deep darkness, shows that complicated aspect. Here are this is a sympathetic chain on each side, and then we have, those are paravertebral ganglia, and then we have the prevertebral ganglia in front of the aorta. If you have Netter's atlas, he does a really good job of illustrating these pathways. They're not in one area, unfortunately. So you have to look at innervation of the lungs or innervation of the uterus or innervation of the penis or something like that. And then he has the sensory fibers, he has the preganglionic and postganglionic, sympathetic and parasympathetic drawn in there. But he doesn't have them all collected in one innervation area. You have to go to the particular organs. So I'll show you where we get those. All right, so this is a paravertebral, this is a sympathetic chain ganglia shown here in the thoracic region. It's been enlarged over here. Here is the spinal cord. I'm actually going to draw the opposite side, but it's going to be the same on both left and right. All right. Here is a lateral gray horn, and preganglionic neurons are shown coming out the ventral root of the lateral gray horn. They are motor. So just like we found the pelvic splanchnic preganglionic yesterday in the ventral root, we also find sympathetic. Now, the most simplest pathway is to come out and synapse right here in the autonomic ganglion. And then it synapses with the postganglionic neuron that goes out with the ventral ramus. Okay, that's the simplest thing to do to get out to the skin. Or it could go up 1 or 2 levels, or it could go down. Okay, so that's what we're going to diagram first. So give me a moment to draw a spinal cord, and I'm just going to draw half as I sit here. So we're going to use red for preganglionic. Try to keep as much writing out of the diagram as possible. And green for postganglionic. So these are all sympathetic. T3 and T4. Okay. So what we're saying is this is the ventral root coming out between the 3rd and 4th thoracic vertebra, and the ventral roots coming out, the spinal nerve coming out between the 4th and 5th thoracic vertebra. We're in that segment of the spinal cord. So at the preview, when I drew the preganglionic, sympathetic preganglionic cell body, it is found in the lateral gray horn. That's why we have a lateral gray horn there. It's because we have these preganglionic cell bodies. It's a motor neuron, right? Our preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are always motor. And so it is going to pass through the ventral root, just like our lower motor neuron does, and our preganglionic parasympathetic lightning. Now it passes into the ventral ramus and leaves the ventral ramus and enters the autonomic ganglion, the paravertebral ganglion. We can draw the same thing for this neuron here. Something I haven't brought out yet is that all of our preganglionic neurons are myelinated. So this bundle of nerves leaving the ventral ramus forms a structure that appears white, and it is known as the white ramus communicantes. Ramus means branch or arm, so it's the white communicating branch. It communicates between the ventral ramus and the autonomic ganglion. And because these fibers are not myelinated, it is the white ramus communicantes. Yes,
Did you say they were myelinated or not myelinated?
they are myelinated. The second one is not myelinated. The postganglionic is not myelinated. So it is gray. So this pattern I'm showing is how we send the postganglionic neuron all the way out to the skin and skeletal muscle. So it is going to synapse, that's why this is a ganglion, because we have a cell body, and it's our postganglionic neuron. And it's going to come back into the ventral ramus, and it's going to join our lower motor neurons going out to the soma of the body. So this is going out to the skin, sweat glands and blood vessels of the skin, and blood vessels of skeletal muscle. Same here. Postganglionic neurons go out to the skin. So because these are not myelinated, then this branch is known as the big surprise, gray rami communicantes. Or gray ramus, plural, singular. So notice it goes past, it drives past the entrance, the exit to get into the entrance. So it's going to go past, so if we look at this one here, notice this one's colored white. So it goes past the gray one, comes in the white one, synapses with the postganglionic neuron, and then the postganglionic neuron forms the gray ramus communicantes because it is unmyelinated. Okay, so this is the simplest way of getting postganglionic neurons out to the skin. These are going to travel with our named nerves, our femoral nerve, tibial nerve, medial nerve, ulnar nerve, going out to the trunk of the body, as well as this, reason your hands get sweaty when you're scared is because these postganglionic neurons are traveling out with the nerves going to the muscles of your upper limb. Okay, so if anybody wants to take pictures?
You know, we're selling all your pictures on eBay, right?
They're not signed. They're worth more if they're
Darn
signed.
it.
I actually had someone tell me they're gonna pay me for my notes and I was like, this is
That's crazy.
what's the name of the ganglion?
They're just called the paravertebral, so I'll write that in. Now that everybody's taking their pictures. So we don't have individual names for these ganglia. So now the next thing that happens, still keeping it relatively simple, is the preganglionic neuron coming in doesn't synapse at that level, but goes up 1 or 2 levels or goes down 1 or 2 levels. This, in fact, is what actually creates the chain. Without that occurring, we would have distinct and separate ganglia just kind of hanging off of the ventral ramus. But because they now go up or down, we can create that chain. Right? So I'm going to leave this in place, and I'm going to draw another neuron showing what can happen if it goes up or down. Okay? Comes in the white ramus communicantes, but instead of synapsing here, it's going to go up 1 or 2 or 4 or 5 levels, or go down and synapse 1 or 2 or more levels. And again, that creates the chain. Are these fibers going up? This one can have and go up to a postganglionic neuron. Comes out.
From the lateral brain hormone.
So it's exactly the same event, except it's going up a few levels or going down a few levels. And then still going out to the skin and the muscle blood vessels. It's not innervating the muscles, remember, those are voluntary muscles, the somatic skeletal muscles. It's going to blood vessels within those to affect their diameter. Now I've drawn T3 and T4. This would happen all the way from T1 to L2. Okay? So any of those levels would be included in this illustration. So innervating ventral rami within the thoracic lumbar regions of the spinal nerves. So here we see this is a very large enlargement diagram of the intercostal region. So you're seeing the trachea. You're seeing the trachea right here. And this is actually vagus nerve coming in here and providing the plexus on the esophagus. So here is a ventral ramus of a thoracic spinal nerve going out to innervate the skin, and here it's innervating the muscles between the ribs. So what I've drawn in red is the preganglionic neuron. At each level, coming into the paravertebral ganglion at that level. And then it will synapse with the postganglionic neuron. And notice the postganglionic neuron goes out the gray ramus communicantes. As I indicated, we have very few and very little indicated in models on the autonomic nervous system. So most of your lab questions and exam questions on the autonomic nervous system will be from these diagrams that I'm showing in class. Not everybody has netters, but these are the diagrams that I would be using. So I could ask you to identify that ganglion. We don't know we don't have a specific name for it, so it's going to just be paravertebral ganglion, all right? Or I could ask you to identify this structure right here, and that would be a white ramus communicantes, and the one more medial would be a gray. Okay. So again, we looked at this pattern where it's at the same level. And these postganglionic neurons releasing norepinephrine are going to end up at the skin and in these skeletal muscles that you see here. All right, the other pattern that we looked at then was a preganglionic neuron coming in, not synapsing at that ganglion, but going up or going down to go to the postganglionic neuron, still going out the ventral ramus of that particular nerve. Okay? So that's where we've gone so far. Now we need to take care of the cervical spinal nerves that don't have preganglionic neurons. All right? So here is our sympathetic chain, the last of our thoracic, and we have 3 cervical ganglia. One is found at the level of the clavicle, just above. That's the inferior cervical ganglion. We have a middle cervical ganglion, and then we have a large superior cervical ganglion. So I'm going to change the spinal cord diagrams I have. And this one will keep as, say, T3. And we're going to change this to, say, C4. Okay?
Can you show that 3 again?
3, the middle one.
Actually, all 3,
Okay.
please.
So here's inferior, just above the clavicle. Okay. Middle is about the level of your voice box. So if you feel your neck and feel that vibrating structure, that's your voice box. If you come over to the side, that's middle. Superior is up here at the angle of your mandible, just below your ear.
Thank you.
All right, so give me a moment I'm going to leave the spinal cord structure similar, but I'm going to make some changes. So if this is cervical, we have to erase, get rid of our our lateral gray horn, because there is no lateral gray horn in the cervical spinal cord. Because the reason there is no lateral gray horn in the cervical spinal cord is because there are no preganglionic neurons, so I have to get rid of this. And because there are no preganglionic neurons, there's no white ramus communicantes. I have to get rid of that.
Huh? Oh, okay. It's a pretty drawing there.
Okay, the two key differences when we're looking at the cervical level, no lateral gray horn, and only one ramus communicantes. So let's put in our preganglionic neuron again. And it will leave via the ventral root. It will come in the white ramus communicantes at that level. And now it's going to go up. It's going to go up several because I'm missing T3 and T2 and T1. So it's going to go up the spinal cord several levels. And then it's going to form a ganglion. This would be the inferior middle ganglion I've shown here. Maybe the middle. I'll change this to C6. So then that would be the inferior cervical ganglion. So these are the only paravertebral ganglia that have names. And that would be the inferior and middle and superior cervical ganglia. And then our postganglionic neuron is gray. It's unmyelinated, so it's going to go out the gray ramus communicantes. And it's going to go to the skin of the face and the muscles and stuff in the neck. Some of these obviously are going to go a little bit higher. And they're going to go up to the middle and cervical. The middle cervical and superior cervical ganglia. Take a picture. Notice that the cervical level ventral root has no preganglionic cell fiber axon, which fits with that earlier diagram I showed that had only preganglionics coming out of thoracic and lumbar.
Back away from the eraser, please.
Remote detonator eraser.
Game.
Okay, so not good. What I want to show you is
What?
the screen. So again,
What?
looking at what happens at the inferior level. So we have, this would be our highest thoracic paravertebral ganglia. So we have our prevertebral ganglia coming out the ventral root, coming in the white ramus communicantes, and going up to the inferior cervical ganglia, where it meets with the postganglionic neuron and comes out and travels out to the arm.
Do all of the ganglion and cervical come out T4?
No, there would come out various levels, okay? Also, you can see here that in this inferior cervical ganglia, there is more than one, what you would call gray ramus communicantes, because we have 3 cervical ganglia for 8 cervical nerves. So here in the middle one, we have multiple inferior gray rami communicantes, because they have to get to multiple spinal nerves coming from the cervical spinal cord. So I just drew one here, but there would be others going to other spinal nerve levels. Okay, yes?
These are the only places that the preganglias are, or in the
For the cervical level. In the pelvis, we match with each of the spinal nerve levels, but in the cervical level, we only have 3 or 8. Right. And then each get, so here's, let me get to the next slide. So here is the middle cervical ganglia. So it's coming up from, it doesn't have to come from here, but I didn't have a lower ventral ramus to show, but you could also have it coming from up here. Now this one's going to go higher than inferior. It's going to go up to middle. And there in the middle is going to have postganglionic neurons going out multiple gray rami to get to the skin. Also, these postganglionic neurons from both middle and inferior are going to go into the thoracic cavity, come back down the neck, and go into the thoracic cavity to the lungs and the heart.
So they have to place it in this start where.
Right, it could be any level. It's going to be the upper thoracic. It's going to be like T1, T2, T3, T4 along that level. Okay? And then here is the superior cervical ganglia. And again, preganglionic neurons coming up, passing by through the inferior in the middle to get to the superior. And postganglionic neurons there are going to go out the ventral rami to the spinal nerves here supplying the neck. Now, we also use the superior cervical ganglia to supply neurons inside to our glands in the head that we were using parasympathetic. So here's that postganglionic neuron, and it's going to go up through the carotid canal, and these travel with blood vessels inside the skull to come out to, say, the lacrimal gland, or to get to the submandibular gland, or to get to this the constrictor pupils, rather the dilator pupillary muscles in the eye.
So if the middle ganglia will only go as
It'll
far
go to
as the superior ganglia, and then that ganglia takes over
Yeah.
for other things.
So superior is going to do like face and structures, sympathetic. Middle is going to do neck and join with inferior doing neck to actually go back to the thoracic
So
level.
some of the middle ones will
We'll go down, yeah.
Will go past.
Maybe even a few of the superior, there's a lot of overlap because you can see their neurons are over, their nerves are, gray rami are overlapping.
Okay.
So this one's going, so this diagram kind of illustrates that also. So here we have only gray rami.
It's an inflammatory process.
This is showing the thoracic level. So we have
And
preganglionic neurons, and we're looking at this area here. This is a cervical spinal nerve. Notice there's no preganglionic neuron. So this is going to go up in synapse and then come out, and say this one, if this is middle, inferior middle, it can go to the heart. If it's superior, it follows the internal carotid artery and goes to structures in the face. I also have this diagram. These are all from Netter. So here would be the superior cervical ganglia, and then following blood vessels up into the skull and following those blood vessels to the eyeball, to do the smooth muscle, inhibit the ciliary muscle, and activate activate the dilator muscles of the pupil. Okay? Here it's coming up the internal carotid artery and following blood vessels to get to the lacrimal gland and to get to salivary gland. So in all those cases, they're going into the skull with the carotid artery and then following its branches to get to those glands. We don't have any sympathetic structures within the brainstem. So they all have to come from the cervical ganglia. Okay? Predominantly those would be superior. Predominantly inferior and middle are the ones that go back down as postganglionic to get to the thoracic. There might be a little bit of superior, but predominantly inferior and middle. Okay, so we're going to come back, let's stop and take a break. And now we're going to come back and see how, these are all going out to the periphery. Now let's see how these sympathetic fibers get to the organs of the abdomen and pelvis. Okay? So we're going to look at the splanchnic nerves, and we're going to come back and start with the information that's on page 91.
I remember you little
So, 5 after.
All right, coffee.
Coffee time.
At the same level or above or below the level that the preganglionic neuron is coming. So that's the postganglionic neuron going out with the ventral rami of spinal nerves to get to the skin and the skeletal muscles. And then we follow those preganglionic neurons up into the neck to the inferior, middle, and cervical ganglia, where they synapse with the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons to go to the neck, to go to the structures within the head, like the lacrimal gland or the salivary gland or the smooth muscle of the eye, or to go back down into the thoracic region. Now we're going to follow these thoracic and lumbar preganglionic neurons to the organs of the abdomen, okay? And then finally to the organs of the pelvis. So, as you can see in the diagram that I have on the overhead, this is showing the posterior thoracic wall. We looked at this earlier when we were looking at just the level of pre- and postganglionics. Here is our paravertebral ganglia forming the sympathetic chain on each side of the body, and I've been diagramming just the ones on the left side. At the level starting with T5, you can see that the preganglionic neurons, well, you can't see that they're pre here, but preganglionic neurons pass through the ganglia and join up with each other as they move down to form splanchnic nerves. Remember we used the term pelvic splanchnic yesterday with the parasympathetics? All right, these thoracic splanchnic are given the name greater, lesser, and least. So let me diagram what's happening, and then we'll come back to this photo, this diagram, this drawing on the screen, and look at the neurons in place there.
Wow.
So notice we're back in the thoracic level. We have gray rami communicantes and white rami communicantes with their ventral rami, and this would be how they would get out to the skin. We've already diagrammed that, and I'm not going to put that on here, just because it would clutter up the image. So this diagram is just going to cover how we form our splanchnic neurons. All right. So we have in the T5 level of the spinal cord, preganglionic neurons, cell bodies in the lateral great horn. They are going to pass through the ventral root into the ventral ramus. They will enter the sympathetic chain via the white rami communicantes because they are myelinated structures. They are not going to stop here in synapse. They're not going to go up. They're not going to go down. They're going to pass right through the ganglia and pass medially and join up with other preganglionic neurons at lower levels. T5 through, oops, I put T10 here. T5 through T9. All of these join together to form the greater splanchnic nerve. So this level is T9, and we will draw in its cell body. And it will come in, and it will also pass through the ganglion without synapsing. And if I was completely accurate, so I'm missing several ganglia levels here, okay? But they all join together to form this structure, which is the greater splanchnic nerve. And I'm going to illustrate that because I can only draw so many segments on the whiteboard. But what's different here than what we've talked about before is the fact that the preganglionic neuron is passing through the ganglion and not synapsing at all. And then in a moment we'll see where it's synapsing. Okay? Bless you. Or what would have been a blessing? Did it actually sneeze?
She did.
Okay.
Fortunately, yes.
So even though these are thoracic level preganglionic neurons, the structures that they're going to innervate are in the abdominal cavity. So we have to take this nerve into the abdomen. I don't know why this thing is so, I'll leave the diagram on the whiteboard. Let's look what's on our screen. So here is our ventral ramus. Here is our paravertebral ganglion chain. And now here is a preganglionic neuron coming out of the spinal cord. This would be T9, T5 rather. It comes through the white ramus communicantes, just like I drew on this side, but now we're looking on the right side. Coming through and going all the way down. This is forming the greater splanchnic nerve. We add the preganglionic neuron of T6, and we add the preganglionic neurons of T7, T8, and T9. And all of these form the greater splanchnic nerve. Okay. Then we move to, so this was T9 up here. We move to T8, sorry, T10, and T11. And those here's our greater splanchnic nerve right here. And so right next to it, T10 and T11 form the lesser splanchnic nerve. Still preganglionic neurons. And then here is T12, and all by itself, it forms the least splanchnic. So let's look at that one more time. Okay, T5, T6, T7, T8, T9. Their preganglionic neurons travel medially and travel along the vertebral bodies to form the greater splanchnic nerve. Then we look at T8, sorry, I keep going backwards. T11, T10, and T11. They join together. Again, here's greater splanchnic, and they form the lesser splanchnic. And then we have T12, forming the least. Here they all are together. Different, but not the same redding colors that we've had before, just because you would be able to tell the difference. So blue is shown in here as the greater splanchnic. Red is shown as the lesser splanchnic. And the bright yellow is shown as the least. But as I illustrated on the whiteboard, they are formed of preganglionic neurons from those given levels, passing through the ventral root, through the white ramus communicantes, and into the splanchnic nerve. So these are preganglionic, just like our pelvic splanchnic yesterday was preganglionic.
I'm missing my brain. The whole
Can't
brain.
replace that,
It-
but which one do you want?
No one wants it. The whole plastic brain is not.
Did you look at the very top?
Yes.
It should be, it may be over in 457. It should be up here. I've got a knee up there, I've got one slide on that. Check this door. Okay.
Was there anything extra?
Yeah,
That one
it's
was
the
one.
bag,
Right?
yeah.
Not extra, but like.
I have,
recognized.
oh, you want the whole one? But I was, yeah, second 431. I didn't use it. was here earlier in the semester not. It's okay.
Stare down.
I'm thankful for a chance to draw. Or stop thinking for a
Or
minute.
some not think for minutes.
All right, so these are the greater, lesser, and least, and now notice at the very bottom, this is the diaphragm.
Each other now.
So they are going to pass through the diaphragm because that's where the organs are that they are innervating. Remember, we still have preganglionic. So we have to meet up with the postganglionic neurons.
That looks like a
So now
monkey.
this is the diaphragm up here. This blue line right here is that greater splanchnic coming in. Here is the lesser splanchnic coming in, and the bright yellow is the least splanchnic. So let's go back to this picture here. These are the prevertebral ganglia. Along the side, you can see the paravertebral ganglia. That's the sympathetic chain that we've created in our previous sets of diagrams. These ganglia, like the others, are formed of the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. Their postganglionic neurons, as you can see, are going to follow the blood vessels out to the organs that they provide innervation to. At this time, the vagus nerve is also going to join them. So when you look at it in a cadaver or a live human person, you wouldn't know which was vagus and you wouldn't know which was the sympathetic, because they're all traveling together, following the blood vessels out to the organ. So again, here is the greater splanchnic. It ends up, and these ganglia are listed on page 91. So they are named for the arteries that they are located by. Now, we learned these arteries in 431, but this vessel, single vessel right here, is called the celiac trunk. It sends 3 branches, one to the stomach, one to the spleen, and one to the liver. So from the celiac ganglia, there are 2, one here and one here. Postganglionic neurons are forming the celiac ganglia. Okay. Their cell bodies. The postganglionic neuron fibers are going to leave and travel to the stomach, travel to the spleen and the pancreas, and travel to the liver with the blood vessels going along with them. The red ones here are the lesser splanchnic, and they come to these ganglia around the superior mesenteric artery. So they are called the superior mesenteric ganglia. All right? These lower ones are the renal. In the superior mesenteric ganglia, we have cell bodies that then go to the small intestine. Superior mesenteric artery supplies the small intestine. And finally, the least, the bright yellow, comes all the way down here. This happens to be the inferior mesenteric artery going to the descending colon, the large intestine going down the left side of your body. Whoops. So these postganglionic neurons are going to the large intestine. Now I'm going to forward a few more slides here. This is Netter's diagram. It looks about as busy as it is. But just to illustrate what I was talking about, here we are with the inferior mesenteric ganglia, and here are the fibers going out to the descending colon. This is the descending colon going into the pelvis. Okay. So let me back up to this image. So if this is our greater splanchnic nerve, this is going to end up at the celiac ganglia. Right? If we change this to T10 and T11, so before I change this, do you want to take a picture? Let me just draw an arrow showing where this is going. So these are going to the celiac ganglia. Again, remember in this picture, we're missing the incoming preganglionic neurons from T6, 7, and 8. This would be added in here.
I would do something, I would keep it.
All right, now if we change these to T10 and T11, this would be the lesser splanchnic, and it would be going to the superior mesenteric ganglion. I'm not going to take a picture of that because all I did was change the labels. But then we would have a separate nerve. And then if we made this T12, actually let's make this one T12 a little bit easier. This would be the inferior. And this would be the least. So this is providing sympathetic innervation to organs just under the diaphragm via the greater, so stomach, liver, pancreas. Via the lesser, our small intestines. And via the least, the kidneys and part of our large intestine. Okay. So just to explain, I wasn't able to put the postganglionic neurons here. So let me just diagram what this would be coming down to as the lesser. So this would be the diaphragm. Let's make it the greater. It's going to form the celiac ganglion. We would have preganglionic neurons coming in from T5, T6, T7, T8, T9. And the postganglionic neurons would be the postganglionic neurons then would travel with the blood vessels to their organs. So to the pancreas and spleen. Well, the other way around actually. Sorry. Stomach. Pancreas and spleen. And liver. Okay. And this is just the left side, so the same thing would be happening on the right side. So it would be that kind of the end of my diagram over there on the right when I drew the greater splanchnic nerve. If I were to draw the lesser, I just draw the same thing but coming down farther and going to the superior mesenteric ganglion. For the least, coming down farther and going to the inferior mesenteric ganglion. So this is a continued, pardon? This is left side. This would be a continuation of the picture I drew for the greater splanchnic that ended here. It doesn't match the one that's up there right now because that's the least splanchnic.
That sounds like it often.
Sorry.
Okay. Did you hear it? What kind of animals?
So is there anything confusing about this that I can explain before we go on? Because we're just going to add more layers of stuff, but nothing drastically different from this. Different destinations. All right, so the next information that we have are the lumbar splanchnics, and those are not very much different. We just stay at the same level where we were. In fact, I'm not going to even change the diagram, change the label. So instead of being the thoracic level, these are going to be the lumbar level. So we'll say, which stops at L2. So we'll say L1 and L2 here. Preganglionic neuron, doing the same thing. The difference here is they don't join together to form major nerves. The lumbar splanchnics stay more individual. Okay. And they can do two things. Most of them will end up in the inferior mesenteric ganglion that our least one did. So they will end up in the inferior mesenteric ganglion, and then like the T12, which they're very close to because we go T12 and L1 and L2, these postganglionic neurons will go to the descending colon. That's what you see on page 91. Okay? The descending colon and the kidney. So on the screen, I'll let you take your picture first. Let me just write a definition. If we look at the diagram on the screen, what we're seeing here is inferior mesenteric, and these are the splanchnics coming in here, the lumbar splanchnics. Okay? So these are the lumbar splanchnics coming in here, and then sending fibers out to the kidney. The next thing that happens is they send fibers down towards the pelvis. So I'm going to pull the screen up and give a image I erased earlier. Give a diagram of this area. Because now we're looking at how we provide innervation to the pelvic organs, and we do it via these lumbar splanchnics coming in here, forming a structure known as the superior hypogastric plexus. Remember the rat's nest I talked about yesterday? That was down inside the pelvis. The superior hypogastric plexus isn't quite as large. And from the superior hypogastric plexus, we have a bundle of nerves descending called the hypogastric nerves. And they go into the inferior hypogastric plexus. So I'm going to draw this area right here that you see on the board behind the screen.
Back on the hypogastric nerve. That's the- Which one's the right now?
This is pointing to the inferior mesenteric, which is over here, not here. That's not exactly.
I'll draw the level of detail over on that side, but just to kind of give you a more schematic diagram. Here's our lumbar spinal cord. It has the lateral gray horn. So we have preganglionic neurons coming into and passing through our superior hypogastric plexus. So just a maze of neurons. And these would be our lumbar splanchniks, ones that did not end in the inferior mesenteric ganglion. This would be our superior hypogastric plexus. And then these neurons would pass through that and down into the pelvis as the hypogastric nerves. Now I'm drawing them here as a single nerve, but they're really multiple bundles of nerves that are descending. And then within the true pelvis, down in here, along the lateral wall, we have the inferior hypogastric plexus. And these are going to end within the inferior hypogastric plexus and synapse with postganglionic neurons. That would go to, we used the bladder yesterday, so let's continue with that. That should really be in the middle. My bladder is not way over here on the outside of my body, but for clarification, not for clarification, but I don't have room on my board. Here's my urinary bladder. Well, not mine, but. And the postganglionic neuron is going to come into the wall of the urinary bladder. We only have one, so both of them will come into the wall of the urinary bladder to innervate it. We don't have any more names for those neurons, okay? We call this the inferior hypogastric plexus, but we don't label the postganglionic sympathetic neurons because we can't see them as individual nerves. So we're going to deal with function on Tuesday, But what do you think the function is? Sympathetic's effect on the bladder wall is to contract it or relax it? Relax. Remember, going to the bathroom is parasympathetic. So it's going to cause this to stay relaxed. What's it going to do to the sphincter? Constricts it. Okay? So this is sympathetic. Right? Now we talked about parasympathetic yesterday, remember? So parasympathetic, I'm going to draw that in blue. Parasympathetic came out of the sacrospinal cord. And so I'm not going to draw the sacrospinal cord in here just because it's not going to add anything. But it came off of the ventral rami and into our inferior hypogastric plexus. This is what we drew yesterday. And then did it synapse? Did it stop in the hypogastric plexus? No. It came out and it, as preganglionic neurons, came into the bladder wall. So these are the pelvic splanchnic nerves. And then their postganglionic neurons were actually found within the bladder wall. So now we need our sacral splanchnics. And that's what I'm going to illustrate over on the far right. If I were to illustrate this part right here, just this part on the board, then I would, this is going to be L2. And I'm just going to erase the spinal cord here. All of this exists, I'm just taking it out of that picture. This would be splanchnic. Lumbar splanchnic. This would be superior. Hypogastric plexus. So our preganglionic sympathetic neuron passes through the lumbar splanchnic into the superior hypogastric plexus, does not synapse, continues into my inferior hypogastric plexus via the hypogastric nerve. And enters the inferior hypogastric plexus within the pelvis itself. Bladder. And here the posterior ganglionic neuron is going to go into the bladder. So take a picture of that if you want, and then I'll go over the same information on Netter's diagram. I essentially just redrew what I showed over on the left side.
That's what I'm home for. Here's sugar. Right there, sugar.
Old school.
No, we don't want to, sorry.
Did you do this?
I have a little bottle on each other.
Oh, yeah. When you
A big heart.
Stop writing out my page.
Okay. Got hearts on each other.
Let go and it was like cookies.
This happens.
What?
Goes inside the pattern.
Boy said cooties, so if you get a cootie shop and you wouldn't get cooties. So basically, we drop those.
When you're ready.
Right, so that was right. They're boots.
They're not, it's a cootie shop, but as we got older, we realized that they were cooties.
These have cooties, sorry.
This guy's gross and they smell funny.
Cause what?
Guys are gross and they smell funny.
Are we taking a break?
Thank you, got it.
Chocolate. The second one, no, because it's the same as the first one.
It's the same thing, isn't it?
So we should be more strong. It's the first one.
She's pulling up netters.
All right, so here's the diagram on netters.
Wait, 1 second.
Okay,
Yeah, I got
sorry.
it. Okay, never mind, sorry, go ahead.
It's all right, no, I got it, okay.
I was just checking.
So this is a diagram of netters showing innervation of the bladder and the rectum, which is what we just described. We're almost done. 1 o'clock. I'm sorry, I just like math.
You like what? Math?
Math.
Math.
I hate them, I just get screwed up with
The crazy
directions.
thing is that you can just draw all this, just freehand.
And so quickly.
You should see our drawings.
Once you do it again, though.
Hey, speak for yourself. Yeah, everybody else is giving you looks.
Okay, so this is Netter's
I
diagram
got this.
showing the rectum here and the bladder. So coming out the spinal cord, this would be a preganglionic neuron. This would be the superior hypogastric plexus. It's coming down the hypogastric nerve, coming into the inferior hypogastric plexus. Okay? Superior's right here, right at the top of the sacrum.
That's the inferior.
Okay? And inferior is down inside the true pelvis.
Right.
Look at where the mercury is. What will he do? No, see, at the top where like the archy thing is.
Yeah.
That's the superior.
Right. Which is up here.
No.
Superior.
That's over there.
All right, so now here's the postganglion. Whoops, my picture moved.
We should ask. That's the leg of the monkey right there.
I don't know.
So that's the monkey's mouth.
No thing.
So here's the cell body of the postganglionic neuron that's inside the inferior hypogastric plexus. And here's the postganglionic neuron going to the wall of the bladder. Okay, so that's what I drew here with superior hypogastric plexus here. It passes through that as a hypogastric nerve and then enters into the inferior hypogastric plexus, so we have the cell body, only for sympathetic postganglionic neurons. Where is the cell body for our postsympathetic? In the wall, exactly right. Okay? So in this diagram, this is showing the same thing, but for our sympathetic, our sacrosplanchnic nerves. And so this is what I want to diagram now. So we're going to look at, this is lumbar splanchnic, to go to inferior mesenteric ganglia, and lumbar splanchnic to go down to the inferior hypogastric plexus. So now, finally, shows at the end of the day and the end of the week, we are at, so if you look on page 91, so we talked about greater splanchnic, we we talked about lesser and least and lumbar splanching. Okay, now we're ready to do take home. Now this is out of hearing. My daughter insisted last night that we drive all the way down to Lodi to buy this medicine for the horse. And we drove home, and she's going back today for a lesson, but she couldn't get to the vet's office to get the medicine, so we had to get it yesterday so she could have it today. So last night I said it would be pointless to make this trip if you don't forget to take this medicine with you. This morning in the car I said, don't forget to take the medicine. I get to school and she'd forgotten the medicine. So that's why she had to come back in here to get it. Anti-ulcer medication for her horse who's high strung. Good enough? It costs $150 for a 3-month supply, and her friends that were taking care of her horse in the week before she couldn't get there, instead of giving a quarter of a teaspoon every day or a quarter of a tablespoon every day, we're giving an entire tablespoon. So in 3 weeks, the entire $150 worth of medicine was being used up. So she now has to dispense it into individual doses for each day.
A little strange day.
Which is worth it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to draw the spinal cord thing all over
I
again.
think I have to order it.
Not
So.
something I'm doing, it's just easier to redraw it. So what we're looking at here is kind of the equivalent of the bottom diagram on page 17. So a very alert student found a problem with this diagram. Can anybody find it? Bottom of page, 16. Bottom of page 16. There is a problem with that diagram. Read the description and then see if you can find the problem with the diagram.
Oh my gosh, that's what I was going to say. No, she said 16.
Bottom of 16, I changed it because I missed it.
Is it missing a communicantes?
No, it should be missing one.
You're awesome, Trish. Hi, there.
How much further down can it
Is
go?
it not supposed to have one of the 3 or the 12?
No?
How much?
It does have something it's not supposed to have though.
Wouldn't it just stop right there? It's just going down because it's like very bottom anyway.
Sure.
That's something
The larger,
it shouldn't have.
this one?
No, that's supposed to have
How
that.
can you be right? I'm gonna freak out.
Say it.
I'm not gonna say it. I'm gonna keep quiet and let somebody else get it right.
Get all
Because I
that.
told you
And
so.
I'll just feel fuzzy inside.
And someone says we don't have the answer.
I thought it was true. I mumble things over here, and then it ends up being right.
And she's like, see, I knew it. Sure.
It makes them so much better. I was trained properly.
I'm gonna get to it pretty soon.
No one knows. Or maybe not.
Only the shadow lies in the heart. Here, that's one.
I actually didn't hear what you said.
I'm missing one of the,
Damn it.
No, I already said that.
See, I might have said that, yeah.
No, it has something that it shouldn't have, right?
Yes.
No, I was wrong.
Reread the description of what level we're at.
See?
Correct.
Are we
It
not?
has something it shouldn't have at the sacral level.
Of
What? Lateral gray horn.
Dude, I knew it.
The sacral spinal cord does not have a lateral gray horn, and in the diagram it does.
It's true.
So scribble that one out.
We think that was a pretty ganglion.
So we looked at this when we were diagramming the
That's so
pelvic
right.
splanchnic. So now we're going to do, remember we have descending neurons, we have no preganglionic sympathetic beyond L2. I said that earlier, and I know I said a lot of things in the last couple of hours, so that's why I'm reminding
Can
you.
you say it again?
There are no preganglionic neurons below L2. So the ventral roots of all of our sacral spinal nerves are not going to have any preganglionic neurons. But we still have organs in the pelvis that need sympathetic innervation, all right? We need to relax our bladder. We use sympathetic innervation in reproduction for the oviducts and for the seminal vesicles. Prostate glands to secrete, so they still need their sympathetic components. That's going to come from the lumbar region. The upper ones from our lumbar splanchnics, but most of the pelvis is going to come from our sacral splanchnics, which are still coming from the lumbar spinal cord. So here is our preganglionic neuron. It's going to come in through the white rami communicantes into our sympathetic chain. It is going to descend to the level of the sacral spinal cord, and then it's going to pass through without synapsing and go to the inferior hypogastric plexus, just like we talked about before. And this nerve is called a sacral splanchnic. Okay? So remember, the lumbar splanchnic went first into the superior and down the hypogastric nerve. This comes all the way down to the sacral level within the pelvis itself and exits through the ganglion to enter into our inferior hypogastric plexus. So this is identified as a sacral splanchnic nerve. And again, we have multiple ones coming off of each level. This would be identified as the inferior hypogastric plexus again. If I draw my bladder over here, the postganglionic neuron, its cell body will be in the inferior hypogastric plexus, and then it will enter the bladder. So notice, no preganglionic sympathetic fibers. My final diagram is going to tie this together with our parasympathetic system from yesterday. Okay, but I don't want to do that just yet. So you can take a picture of that. I've left off the lumbar splanchnic here, okay, just because they would be way too confusing to try to put all that in there. So we're focusing here on the sacral splanchnic. Remember, S for sympathetic. Pelvic splanchnic, PS for parasympathetic. All right, now let's see how that looks on. Let's see how that looks on our diagram. Here's the diagram I showed you yesterday. Remember, this is a sagittal view. Here would be, well, you tell me, what would this be right here?
Rat's nest.
No, that's down here.
Okay.
What connects the superior rat's nest with the inferior rat's nest?
Nerves.
The hypogastric nerve. Okay, so this would be one of our pair of hypogastric nerves, the other one's over here. So here is our sympathetic ganglia. Coming out of the sympathetic ganglia, going into the ventral ramus, would be the postganglionic neuron that we first described at the beginning of lecture today, that would be going out the sciatic nerve, going to the skin and muscles of your lower extremity. That's what this neuron is doing. This nerve, these would be gray rami communicantes. All right. So this right here is a gray ramus communicantes. It's carrying postganglionic neurons from this structure into the ventral ramus and out the sciatic nerve to go to skin and muscles of your blood vessels in your leg. This ventral ramus from the sacral spinal cord also contains preganglionic sympathetic fibers, parasympathetic fibers that we'll come back to. So what I just diagrammed on the board is here. Preganglionic fibers coming down from the lumbar region of the spinal cord pass through the ganglia without synapsing and form a sacral splanchnic nerve going into the inferior hypogastric plexus, as seen here. Okay? So red, preganglionic sympathetic neuron passing through the ganglion without synapsing, coming along a sacral splanchnic going into the inferior hypogastric plexus. Here is a postganglionic neuron sending fibers to the bladder, sending fibers to the uterus. So this is more of an anatomical illustration of what I have diagrammed on the board. So this preganglionic sympathetic fiber coming down through here, this structure right here is the same as this one right here, and the same as this one right here. And then within the inferior hypogastric plexus, we have the cell body of the postganglionic neuron going to the bladder. Okay. That's the end of new material. And now I just want to finish by bringing back the parasympathetic pelvic we talked about yesterday. Let's go back to this diagram. Everybody has a picture of it like this that wants it, because I'm not going to erase anything. I'm going to add the pelvic splanchnic. So let's use blue again for our parasympathetic, like we did on the previous page. Parasympathetic is not going to be in lumbar. It's going to be in the sacral region of the spinal cord. So we're going to start it here. It is still motor, so like I drew yesterday, it's going to pass out the ventral root into the ventral ramus. But it doesn't go into our gray ramus communicantes. Okay? It is going to go into the, as it leaves, it's going to form the pelvic splanchnic. Is it going to synapse in our inferior hypogastric plexus? No. It's going to go pass through it, and then the postganglionic neuron will be found in the wall. So this is what I drew yesterday. Draw a little better. Okay, let me label that, and you can take a picture. So this would be a preganglionic and postganglionic parasympathetic. If you want me to put that in, let me just. I'll add that to my code, that's all.
Why isn't it green?
Okay.
Supposed to be. Para. Okay, got it. Yeah. There is no pair of posts. What were you about to say then?
I'm not talking to you.
There's no pair of posts.
Do you have all these posters online?
Alright.
These, not without the colors, I just put the colors on today.
Can you add the colors on there?
Please, I don't remember what it's called.
I'll put them as one, I have
Thought
multiple
it was
steps,
something different.
so I'll take those out.
This is a ganglion.
This is the
The red and the green.
But I mean, it's like on the greater spline neck, I showed 25, and then I showed 26, and then I showed 7. I'll just show all of them together.
Yeah, because I have it on the recorders.
So because it happens sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Because it happens.
Okay, so the last thing I wanted, there's two more things I want to show you. Nothing new, summarizing stuff together. So if we look on this slide, so this is that same slide that I showed you, sympathetic. Here is parasympathetic. Here's our ventral rami. This is what we showed yesterday. Here is the pelvic splanchnic coming out of the ventral rami. Okay? Whereas sacral splanchnic is coming off the sympathetic chain. So here in red is the parasympathetic coming out the ventral ramus, not from the chain, it looks like that, but it's coming out the ventral ramus, forming the pelvic splanchnic, passing through the inferior hypogastric plexus without stopping, and finding its postganglionic neuron in the bladder wall. Okay. So that's similar to what I added to the board. There are no other, we could put all the stuff together and put in all the descending and ascending. All right? For picture only, I'm going to do that. Don't look at this until you've studied the other stuff, okay? But just so you have it all together on one picture, I'm going to provide that for this. So we have a preganglionic neuron coming in the white ramus, going up. We have a preganglionic neuron coming in the white ramus, going down. And one just staying at that level. Each of these can synapse with a postganglionic neuron going out the ventral ramus. This will go out the gray rami communicantes. Okay. So at the sacral level, we still have a gray rami communicantes. You guys can see the lower motor neurons on your own, but that's not the topic of today's lecture. Okay, now I'm done. 3 minutes after. I'm sorry. A little bit long then. Delete the last 3 minutes of your lecture. Now, this said, it didn't say sympathetic or parasympathetic. So this is going to be parasympathetic, and I always say the one who went out the pelvic plate.
Лена, о чем мы сейчас
Okay,
говорим?
so this, so this, the equivalent of that neuron that's drawing, would be the blue one. Okay?
Так один за одним.
And then this would be the red and green.
Я вообще не хейт.
Yeah, because it didn't say sympathetic or parasympathetic. Yeah, okay.
Ты сказала разом шляпы.
You're going to do that tonight, hopefully.
Probably this afternoon. I'm stuck in my office until 5, 7, whatever.
Did you just say you're stuck in your office?
Well, I don't have office hours today, so I'm officially done at 1:30. And my kids are done with school at 12. But my son has to practice. He's playing the drums for church tomorrow. His practice is up here. Church is now a mile away. He doesn't start till 5. So it hardly makes sense to drive down to Elk Grove and then drive back again. So he gets done at 7. So I'm stuck in my office till 7. That's what I meant. I was stuck in my office.
Well, you have time to check all the labs.
Yeah, I brought labs with me. I brought my lecture exams back up from Penn State. And I can get this done in 6 hours probably.
Awesome. Not that you're stuck, but awesome. You get all that done.
I know exactly what you mean.
Okay, I'm like, don't think it the wrong way, please. So I get to go home and re-listen to all your lectures and try to figure it out. time that I, you have them up, I'll have a chance to,
I've gone through everything.
yeah, and then I can cut them and then follow them.